It was around 750 AD. The air on the coast of Norway was clean and sharp. It smelled of salt and pine. For a farmer named Einar, it mostly smelled of hard work. His farm was a small patch of land carved out of the forest, overlooking a fjord. The soil was rocky. The growing season was short. Every year was a battle. He and his family worked from sunrise to sunset just to have enough to survive the long, dark winter. They grew barley and oats, they raised a few cows and sheep. It was a life of constant effort for small rewards. And Einar was a good farmer, but he was also a good sailor. He had to be. The fjord was his road. The sea was his second field. He fished for cod and herring to supplement their diet. He used a simple boat, heavy and slow, powered by oars. It was good for getting around the fjord, but not for the open sea. He could see the distant islands, but he couldn't reach them safely. Then things started to change. Down the coast, in places like Vestfold, shipbuilders were trying new ideas. And Einar heard stories from traders who passed through his fjord. They talked about new ships. These ships were longer and narrower. They were built differently, with overlapping planks, clinker built, that made the hull strong but flexible. They could bend with the waves instead of fighting them. They had a keel, a long piece of timber along the bottom that gave the ship stability. And they had a mast and a large square sail. One year, a chieftain from the south sailed into Einar's fjord with one of these new ships. Einar had never seen anything like it. It sat low in the water, sleek and dangerous looking. It moved faster under sail than anything he had ever imagined. But the most amazing part was how it came ashore. The chieftain didn't need a deep harbor, he just ran the ship right up onto the beach. Its draft was so shallow it could float in just a few feet of water. Einar watched them. He saw how a crew of 30 men could row it with speed when the wind died. He saw how they could turn it quickly. This ship wasn't just for fishing or trading, it was a tool of incredible potential. It could go anywhere. It could cross the open sea. It could navigate shallow rivers. It could land on any beach. Or for a man like Einar, whose life was defined by the limits of his land and his old boat, this new longship was a revelation. His seasonal search for resources had always been a struggle against nature. He fought the soil for grain and the nearby waters for fish. But this ship offered a new way. The world was suddenly much bigger, and it was full of other people's resources. The thought was a quiet one at first. A seed planted in the mind of a farmer who was tired of being poor. He and thousands like him were peaceful. They were farmers and fishermen, but they were on the edge of a transformation. This new ship wasn't just a piece of technology, it was the key that would unlock a new enterprise, one of military and economic force that would change the course of history. The age of the raider was about to begin, not in a king's hall, but on a rocky farm overlooking a fjord. Number 19, the ship was a key, but not the only one. Leif, the shipwright, ran his hand over the smooth oak plank. It was a good piece of wood, felled from the heart of the forest during the last winter. He and his sons had spent months shaping it with their axes and adzes. Now, it was ready to be fitted onto the hull of the new ship they were building. It was the year 785 AD, and Leif was working on his third longship. He wasn't a chieftain or a great warrior. He was a craftsman. His world was the smell of wood shavings and hot tar. But he understood power. He was building it. The ship rising from the beach in front of him was the most advanced piece of technology in his world. He remembered the old cargo boats, the nars. They were wide and deep, good for carrying goods, but slow. They were tubs. This new ship was a predator. Leif was part of a generation of shipbuilders who had perfected the design. The secret wasn't one single invention. It was a combination of things. He pointed to the long timber running down the center of the ship's bottom. The keel, that was the backbone. It gave the ship strength and helped it sail straight. Older boats had been more like rafts. The keel let this ship bite into the water. Then there were the planks. Leif's team had split the oak logs along the grain, not sawn them. This made the planks incredibly strong and flexible. They overlapped each plank, clinker style, and fastened them with iron rivets. From the inside, they looked like steps. This method made the hull a single, cohesive skin. It could twist and flex in the rough North Sea, absorbing the shock of the waves. A rigid ship would break. Leif's ship would bend. But the real magic was its shape. It was long and narrow, a ratio of about 7-to-1. This made it fast, and it had a shallow draft. Leif knew the ship, fully loaded with 40 men, would draw less than a meter of water. This was the part that chieftains got excited about. It meant the ship didn't need a harbor. Any sandy beach was a port. Any river was a highway. You could take this ship places no one expected a warship to go. The dual power system was another piece of the puzzle. Leif was supervising the carving of the oar ports, small circular holes along the ship's side. With a good wind, the huge square sail could push the ship at 10 knots or more. But when the wind died, or when they needed to make a stealthy approach up a river, the oars came out. A team of rowers could keep the ship moving with surprising speed and precision. It was an all-terrain vehicle for the water. Leif's client, a local leader named Harold, came to inspect the work. Harold wasn't thinking about trade. He had heard stories of lands to the west, across the sea, lands with people who prayed to a soft god and stored their wealth in unguarded buildings by the coast. For Harold looked at the ship, at its dragon-headed prow designed to strike fear. He saw a tool. Leif saw it too. He was a farmer in the off-season. He knew the struggle. He knew the hunger for something more than what the land could provide. He was building ships that could carry traders, but he was also building ships that could carry raiders. The same design that made it a perfect coastal trader also made it a perfect coastal raider. It was fast, it could go anywhere, and it could carry enough men and supplies for a short, profitable voyage. The technology of the ship was the enabler. It opened the door, but it wasn't the reason men like Harold walked through it. The ship was a weapon, yes, but a weapon is useless until someone decides to pick it up. Leif finished his work for the day. He knew he was a good shipwright. He was proud of his creation. He just didn't know that the beautiful, deadly ships he was building would soon let his people write their names across Europe in fire and steel. The ship was the key, but the reasons they turned that key were far more complex. It's number 18, The Land Ran Out. And Sten stood on the hillside and looked down at his family's farm. It was the summer of 802 AD. The farm was nestled in a small green valley in western Norway. It wasn't much. A longhouse, a few outbuildings, and fields of barley hemmed in by steep rocky slopes. For his entire life, this small patch of land had been his whole world, but it was not his future. His older brother, Eric, stood beside him. Eric was the firstborn. By law and tradition, the farm would be his. All of it. The idea of splitting it was absurd. Divided, the farm would not be able to support either of their families through the winter. It was barely enough for one. This was the reality of their lives. Land was everything, and there was not enough of it. For generations, their family had survived on this farm. They cleared a few more trees, pulled a few more rocks from the soil, but they had reached the limit. The mountains were on one side, the sea on the other. There was nowhere left to expand. Sten was 18 years old, strong and capable. And he was effectively homeless. He had options, none of them good. He could stay on as a hired hand for his brother, a servant in his own home. He could try to find another farmer who needed help, working for meager wages. Or he could marry into a family with land, but he had nothing to offer. He had no wealth, no property to bring to a marriage. He was a second son. A man with a strong back and no inheritance. This scene was being repeated all over Scandinavia. Families were getting larger. The land was not. The old way of life was under pressure. A young man's worth was tied to his property. Without it, he had no status. He could not start a family of his own. He was a nobody. The frustration and a sense of hopelessness were a constant dull ache. That evening, a visitor came to their longhouse. His name was Olaf. He was a cousin who had left the region a few years ago, but the Olaf who returned was not the boy Sten remembered. Well, he wore a fine wool cloak dyed a deep red. He had a silver ring on his arm and a new sword at his hip with a polished hilt. Olaf didn't talk about farming. He talked about the sea. He talked about a voyage he had taken to the west with a chieftain named Ragnar. They had sailed for 3 days and found a coastline with gentle hills and wide, slow rivers. He spoke of buildings made of stone, filled with gold and silver crosses, goblets, and books with decorated covers. The men who lived there were soft, he said. They were priests who didn't carry weapons. Olaf's story was not about glory or battle. It was a business report. He described how they beached their ship, ran to the monastery, took what they could carry, and were gone before any local lord could gather his soldiers. They had returned with enough wealth to buy their own land, to attract wives, to build their own longhouses. Olaf was no longer a landless second son. He was a man of means. Sten listened. So did Eric. Eric was happy for his cousin, but his future was here on the farm. His path was set. For Sten, Olaf's story was not just a story. It was a map. It was a possible future. A future he could seize for himself. The danger was real, of course. Men were lost at sea. Men died in fights. But what was the alternative? A long, slow life of poverty and insignificance? The next morning, Sten made his decision. He would go with Olaf on the next voyage. He had nothing to lose and everything to gain. He was not an evil man. He was a farmer's son with no farm. He was driven by the most basic of human needs, the desire for a place in the world, for a family, for a future. The scarcity of land at home was a powerful push, sending thousands of young men like him out onto the sea. They were not leaving to conquer. They were leaving to build a life they could not have at home. The raids were a desperate, violent solution to a simple, intractable problem. The land had run out. Number 17, their gods didn't forbid it. The year is 810 AD. On a small island off the coast of Denmark, a chieftain named Bjorn prepares for a voyage. He is not a king. He is a local leader, his power based on his wealth and his reputation. This morning, he stands before a circle of stones, a sacred grove. With him is the local Gothi, the man who speaks to the gods. The air is thick with the smoke of a fire and the smell of blood. A horse has just been sacrificed. Its meat will be cooked and shared in a feast. Its blood has been sprinkled on the carved wooden idols of the gods and on the men who will be sailing with Bjorn. This is not a scene of dark magic. It is a business transaction with the divine. Bjorn asks for Odin's favor. Odin is the god of wisdom, poetry, and war. He is the Allfather, but he is a fickle and dangerous patron. A sacrifice to him is a request for cunning and victory in the coming conflict. Bjorn does not ask for forgiveness for what he is about to do. The thought would not even occur to him. He also makes an offering to Thor. Thor is the god of thunder, the protector of mankind. His hammer, Mjolnir, defends the world of men from the giants. A prayer to Thor is a prayer for strength and for a safe journey across the dangerous sea. And he might say a quiet word to Njord, the god of the sea and winds, to grant them fair passage. The Gothi chants, interpreting the patterns of the smoke, the way the blood fell. He declares the omens are good, the gods are pleased, the voyage will be a success, this ritual is crucial. For Bjorn and his men, their worldview is not divided into good and evil in the Christian sense. It is a world of order and chaos, honor and shame. Their gods are not gentle shepherds of mankind. They are powerful, flawed, and often treacherous beings who value strength, courage, and cunning. For Odin himself is a trickster who breaks oaths to get what he wants. When Bjorn and his crew sail west and land on the coast of Francia, they will see churches and monasteries. To them, these are not holy places. They are the halls of a foreign rival god, and this god seems weak. His followers do not fight. They store their wealth in open, undefended buildings. Taking this wealth is not a sin. It is a demonstration of their own strength and the favor of their gods. There is no concept of Thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not steal, that applies to outsiders. The moral code is for the community. You do not steal from your neighbor. You do not kill a member of your clan without cause, which would lead to a blood feud. But people from across the sea, they are not part of the community. They are fair game. Furthermore, a glorious death in battle is the highest honor a man can achieve. If a warrior dies bravely, the Valkyries will carry him to Valhalla, Odin's great hall. There he will feast and fight alongside the gods until Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of the world. Quiet death of old age in a bed is seen as a straw death, something to be pitied. This belief system actively encourages risk-taking and martial prowess. It removes the moral barriers to raiding. It frames violence not as a sin, but as a potential path to glory, wealth, and a desirable afterlife. When Bjorn and his men storm the monastery, they are not acting in a moral vacuum. They are acting within their own moral and religious framework, or a framework that sees their actions as legitimate, honorable, and pleasing to their powerful, warlike gods. They are not nihilists, they are believers, and their beliefs gave them permission to do what they did. The lack of a divine prohibition was, in effect, a divine license. Number 16, a warming climate pushed them out. Astrid checked the grain storage pit. It was the autumn of 820 AD, near the settlement of Kaupang in southern Norway. The harvest had been good. Again, she was old enough to remember the stories from her grandmother, tales of long, hard winters and short, unpredictable summers. She remembered years when the barley barely ripened before the first snows came. People went hungry. The children grew sick. But for most of Astrid's life, things had been different. The winters were still cold, but they were shorter. The summers were longer and warmer. The sea ice was less of a problem, opening up sailing routes for more of the year. This period, which scientists would later call the medieval warm period, was changing life in Scandinavia. At first it was a blessing. The good harvests meant more food. More food meant the population began to grow. Fewer children died in their first winter. More people lived to have children of their own. The small farming communities along the fjords and coasts began to feel crowded. The warming climate had a direct effect on the land. In the highlands, trees began to grow at higher elevations. This allowed farmers to push their pastures further up the hillsides, grazing their cattle and sheep on land that was previously too cold. For a generation or two, this expansion relieved some of the pressure, but it was a temporary solution. The population was growing faster than the new land could support it. The farms, passed down from father to son, were still not large enough to be. The problem of the landless second and third sons became more acute than ever. The blessing of a warmer climate and more food had created a new crisis, a population boom in a land that was still fundamentally marginal. The climate also changed the sea. Warmer waters may have affected fish stocks, pushing traditional fishing grounds further north or into deeper waters, requiring longer and more dangerous voyages. But the most significant impact was on travel. With less sea ice in the north and fewer devastating storms, the North Atlantic became more predictable, more navigable. Astrid's two sons, Finn and Ivar, felt these pressures directly. Finn, the elder, would inherit their small farm. Ivar, strong and ambitious, had no prospects at home. But he heard the stories in the marketplace at Kaupang. Stories of new lands being discovered to the west. Iceland, the Faroes, lands with no people, just endless green pastures. He also heard the other stories, the stories of raids on the coast of the Frankish Empire. The warm climate had made the population of Scandinavia more robust. These were not starving, desperate people fleeing a famine. They were a well-fed, growing population that had outstripped its resources. They had the energy, the manpower, and the ambition to look outwards. The same climate that benefited the Scandinavians also made Northern Europe a more attractive target. Agriculture was flourishing there as well. Monasteries and towns were growing wealthier. The warming trend created a perfect storm. It produced a surplus of young, land-hungry men in the north. It made the sea voyage to the south easier and safer, and it made the targets in the south richer and more tempting. Astrid worried for Ivar. He was restless. He looked at the sea not as a source of fish, but as a road. The warmth that had made their lives easier for a time had also made the world smaller and more violent. It was a engine-driving change pushing a new generation of Norsemen from their crowded homes out into the wider world. The climate didn't make them raiders, but it created the conditions that made raiding a logical choice. It was an invisible hand subtly pushing them towards their ships.
Number 15. They knew exactly where the money was.
Magnus was a merchant, not a warrior. His ship was a gnar, wide and deep, built for cargo, not for speed. In the year 833 AD, he steered his vessel up the river Scheldt towards the bustling trading town of Dorestad in Frisia. For years, he had been making this journey. He traded furs, walrus ivory, and whetstones from Norway for Frankish wine, fine pottery, and glasswork. He was a peaceful man engaged in peaceful trade, but he was also a spy. Not intentionally, at first. But he was a man who paid attention, he saw things, he saw that Dorestad was a place of immense wealth. Silver coins flowed through its market. Merchants from all over the Frankish Empire gathered there. But he also saw that it was poorly defended. It was a market town, not a fortress. Its defenses were an afterthought. The Frankish king, Louis the Pious, was busy with his own internal squabbles. His sons were rebelling. The empire's attention was turned inward. Magnus talked to other merchants in the taverns. He listened to the local gossip. He learned which monasteries along the coast were famous for their wealth and their libraries. He learned that the monks who lived there were scholars, not soldiers. He heard about the political situation, about which local lord was strong and which was weak. He learned the calendars of religious festivals, times when towns and churches would be full of people and goods, but distracted by prayer. When Magnus returned to his home port in Denmark, he brought with him not just wine and pottery, but also valuable information. He would sit with his local chieftain, a man named Sigurd, and share what he had learned. He would draw maps in the dirt floor of the longhouse, showing the mouths of rivers, the locations of towns, and the best places to land a ship unseen. He told Sigurd about the tides, the currents, and the prevailing winds. He described the layout of the streets in Dorestad. He explained that the real prize in a monastery wasn't just the gold crosses, but the livestock, the food stores, and the people themselves, who could be taken and sold as slaves. This was not a unique situation. For decades before the major raids began, Norse traders had been peacefully interacting with the rest of Europe. They were a familiar sight in the ports of England and Francia. They were seen as savvy but generally peaceful businessmen. No one suspected that these merchants were gathering the intelligence that would pave the way for the raiders who followed. The raiders were not sailing into the unknown. They were not blindly attacking random targets. Their raids were often precise, well-planned operations based on up-to-date information. They knew what they were looking for and, where to find it. They knew the political weaknesses of their targets. They knew when the local armies would be slow to respond. This is why a place like Dorestad was raided repeatedly. The Vikings knew it was a source of renewable wealth. After a raid, the town would rebuild and trade would resume. A few years later, the raiders would return for the new crop of silver. The first Vikings were explorers and traders. The raiders who came after them were simply acting on the market, research their predecessors had provided. Magnus, the merchant, would never lift a sword himself. He had no stomach for it. But the information he provided over a horn of ale to his chieftain was more dangerous than any weapon. He gave the raiders a map and a business plan. The myth is one of savage hordes descending at random. The reality was something closer to corporate espionage leading to a hostile takeover. Number 14, Second Sons had nothing to lose. Harold stood on the shore watching his older brother Gunnar oversee the loading of their father's ship. It was the spring of 840 AD. Gunnar was giving orders, acting every bit the chieftain he would one day become. Your Harold, just a year younger, stood with his arms crossed. He had the same strength, the same skill with a sword and an axe. But he had been born second. In their society, that made all the difference. The system of inheritance was known as primogeniture. The firstborn son inherited the land, the title, the power. It was a practical system designed to keep the family's farm and influence intact. A divided estate was a weak estate, but for a second, third, or fourth son, it was a harsh reality. Harold had no inheritance. He had no land to farm, no followers to command. He could remain in his brother's household, a subordinate for the rest of his life. He could hope for a favorable marriage, but he had little to offer a bride's family. His prospects were bleak. He was a man of high birth with a low future. This created a pool of ambitious, energetic, and often frustrated young men. They were trained as warriors from a young age. They were skilled sailors. They belonged to the elite of society, but they had no clear place within it. They were a social problem waiting for a solution. Raiding became that solution. For Harold, joining a raiding party was not just about wealth. Well, it was about creating his own destiny. It was a chance to build a reputation, a drekka, that would attract his own followers. If he returned from a successful raid with silver in his purse and a new sword at his side, he would no longer be just Gunnar's brother. He would be Harold, a man of note. A chieftain's power was not absolute. It depended on his ability to attract and reward followers. A successful raider could use his plunder to be generous. He could give gifts of arm rings, weapons, and land. This generosity, this milder, bound men to him. A second son like Harold could go from being a nobody to a chieftain in his own right in just a few successful seasons of raiding. The social structure actively encouraged this behavior. It funneled the most ambitious and martial young men, those with the least to lose at home, into the high-risk, high-reward enterprise of Viking raiding. A life of farming was secure, but it was Gunnar's life. A life of raiding was dangerous, but it offered Harold a chance at something that was his own. That afternoon, a longship captained by a man named Care sailed into their fjord. Care was a man of no great lineage, but he had made a name for himself in raids on the Irish coast. He was looking for recruits for a new voyage. He promised adventure and a share of the plunder. Gunnar, the heir, had to refuse. His responsibilities were at home. He had to manage the farm, deal with local disputes, and maintain his family's position. He had too much to lose. Harold, however, walked down to the beach and spoke with Care. He had nothing to lose. His life at home was a dead end. The danger of the sea and the sword was preferable to the certainty of a life lived in his brother's shadow. He was not just seeking treasure, he was seeking a name for himself. He was part of a generation of spare heirs who became the driving force of the Viking Age. They were the ones with the motivation and the freedom to roll the dice. Number 13, silver became an obsession. Rurik was a trader. He spent his summers navigating the great rivers of the east, the Volga and the Dnieper. It was the year 845 AD. His destination was the lands of the Abbasid Caliphate, a place of sprawling cities and unimaginable wealth. He was not there to raid. He was there to trade. He brought furs, amber, and slaves from the north. In return, he received one thing: silver. The silver came in the form of coins, dirhams, stamped with Arabic script that Rurik could not read. But he understood their value. They were pure, of a standard weight. Back in Scandinavia, this silver was transforming society. For centuries, the Norse economy had been a simple one, based on barter and the value of land and cattle. Wealth was tangible. It was the food in your storehouse, the wool on your sheep. But the influx of silver from the east, and later from raids in the west, introduced a new kind of wealth. It was portable, durable, and universally accepted. This created a new kind of economy, a silver economy, and with it a new kind of obsession. A chieftain's power had always been based on his ability to give gifts to his followers. In the old days, that meant giving food, weapons, or a piece of land. But silver was different. It was more flexible. A man could use it to buy whatever he needed. It also allowed for the accumulation of wealth in a way that had been impossible before. And own so much land or so many cows, but You could have a pit in your longhouse filled with silver coins and hack silver, pieces of cut up jewelry and ornaments. This new form of wealth created a powerful incentive. Young men saw that the path to status and power was no longer just through inheritance. It was through the acquisition of silver. And the fastest way to acquire silver was not through trade, which was slow and difficult, but through raiding. A single successful raid on a Frankish monastery could yield more silver than a lifetime of farming. The stories of this easy wealth spread like wildfire. A man could leave as a poor farmer's son and return a few months later with enough silver to buy his own land, attract a wife, and build a following. Archaeologists have found vast hoards of silver all over Scandinavia, thousands upon thousands of Arabic dirhams and Anglo-Saxon pennies. These were not the treasures of kings. Many were buried by ordinary farmers and chieftains. It was their savings, their bank accounts. The sheer volume of this foreign silver shows how central it became to their world. The desire for silver also fueled the slave trade. On his journeys, Rurik and men like him would capture Slavic people from the forests and sell them in the markets of the south. These slaves were a major source of the silver that flowed back to Scandinavia. The raiding in the west served the same purpose. Her monks might be killed, but a healthy young man or woman from an English village was a valuable commodity worth a good amount of silver. This shift to a silver-based economy changed motivations. The goal was no longer just about survival or even local dominance. It became about accumulating a new, powerful symbol of status. It created a feedback loop. The more silver that came into Scandinavia, the more it was desired. The more it was desired, the more men were willing to risk their lives in dangerous raids to get it. Rurik, the trader, was a part of this system. He's not a violent man, but the silver he brought home helped to finance the ships and weapons for the raiders in the west. The obsession with silver was a powerful engine, driving the Norse out into the world in a relentless search for more. It turned farming communities into the headquarters for international armed robbery. Number 12, being a Viking was a summer job. Sven wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. It was late spring, around 850 AD. The sun was warm on his back as he guided the plow through the rocky soil of his farm in Jutland, Denmark. The barley seeds needed to be sown, the fences needed to be mended. His life, for most of the year, was a predictable rhythm of agricultural work. He was a farmer, but Sven had a secret life in a shed near his longhouse. His shield hung on the wall. His spear and axe were oiled and ready. His helmet was packed in a sea chest, along with a change of clothes and some dried fish. In a few weeks, once the planting was done, Sven would cease to be a farmer. He would become a Viking. The term Viking was not an ethnic identity. You were not born a Viking. It was a job title. To go a Viking fara a Viking meant to go on an overseas expedition. For most men like Sven, it was a seasonal activity. It was something you did in the summer months between planting and harvesting. The seasonality was a key aspect of their success. They would gather in the late spring, their ships loaded with supplies. They would use the favorable summer winds to sail to England, Francia, or Ireland. The weather was better, the seas were calmer. This was the raiding season. Their targets were also in the midst of their own agricultural cycle. The local lords and their soldiers were often preoccupied with managing their own lands and harvests. The defenses were not always on high alert. The Vikings could strike and be gone before a serious military response could be organized. By late summer or early autumn, the raiders would turn for home. They needed to be back in time for the harvest. The wealth they had gained from raiding was useless if their families starved over the winter because the crops were not brought in. They would return with their silver, slaves, and other goods. They would bury their treasure, repair their ships, and seamlessly transition back into their lives as farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen. This dual identity made them a difficult enemy to understand and fight. They were not a standing army. They were a militia of farmer warriors. When they were at home, they were just ordinary members of their community. There was no Viking land to conquer. There was no central king to defeat in a decisive battle. You could fight off one group of raiders, but another, completely independent group would appear on a different stretch of coast the following summer. It was a highly effective economic strategy. Farming provided subsistence, the basics of life. Raiding provided the surplus, the capital for investment and social advancement. A man like Sven could use his summer profits to buy more land, to get better equipment, or to increase his status in the community. This system also meant that raiding was a young man's game. Older men with more responsibilities on the farm were less likely to go. It was the younger sons, the men with less to lose and more to gain, who filled the benches of the longships. For a few years, they would live a life of adventure and danger. Then, if they survived and were successful, they would use their wealth to settle down, buy a farm, and become part of the very system that produced the next generation of summer Vikings. As Sven finished his planting, he looked out at the sea. The call of adventure was strong, but so was the pull of his land and his family. He was not a bloodthirsty savage. He was a pragmatic man living in a tough world. Raiding was a dangerous but rational economic choice. It was a summer job that could set him up for life. Number 11, Charlemagne accidentally drew them a map. In the year 800 AD, Charlemagne, the great king of the Franks, was crowned emperor in Rome. He had forged a vast empire that stretched from Spain to Germany. He was a brilliant military leader and a shrewd administrator. He was also, unintentionally, one of the greatest motivating factors for the Viking Age. On the northern border of his empire was the land of the Danes. Charlemagne saw them as a threat. He waged a series of brutal campaigns against the Saxons, the neighbors of the Danes, forcing them to convert to Christianity and submit to his rule. He established a fortified border, the Danevirke, but the relationship remained tense. A Danish chieftain named Godfred saw Charlemagne's power and was not intimidated. He was defiant. He saw the Frankish Empire not as an unstoppable force, but as a giant treasure-filled vault. Charlemagne's conquests had a number of unintended consequences. First, his wars against the Saxons and other northern peoples created a stream of political refugees and exiles who fled to Denmark. They brought with them stories of Charlemagne's wealth, the richness of his churches, and the military tactics of his armies. Oh, they provided the Danes with valuable intelligence. Second, Charlemagne's consolidation of power created a clear, high-value target. Before him, Northern Europe was a patchwork of smaller, poorer kingdoms. Raiding them was a small-scale affair. But Charlemagne's empire was a single, wealthy entity. Its churches and monasteries were bursting with gold, silver, and fine textiles, a result of decades of stability and economic growth under his rule. He had, in effect, put all the gold in one place. Third, after Charlemagne's death in 814 AD, his empire was left to his son, Louis the Pious. Louis was a capable ruler, but he lacked his father's authority. Soon, his own sons began to fight amongst themselves for control of the empire. This led to decades of civil war. The vast, wealthy empire was now distracted and deeply divided. Its borders were neglected. Its armies were busy fighting each other. For the Norse, this was a golden opportunity. A young Dane named Ragnar, perhaps a son or nephew of a chieftain who had defied Charlemagne, would have grown up hearing these stories. He would have known about the wealth of the Franks, and by the 830s and 840s, he would have known that the empire was tearing itself apart. The Frankish civil wars were like a giant flashing sign that said unlocked and unguarded. The Vikings began to exploit this weakness with brutal efficiency. They sailed their longships up the great rivers of the empire, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, striking deep into the heartland. They sacked wealthy trading towns like Dorestad and Quenovich. They burned monasteries and held bishops for ransom. In 845, a Viking leader, possibly the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, did the unthinkable. He led a fleet of over 100 ships up the Seine and attacked Paris itself. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, one of Charlemagne's grandsons, was unable to muster an army to fight them. Instead, he paid them. He gave them 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. This was a disastrous precedent. It taught the Vikings that the Franks were not only rich, but would pay to avoid a fight. The raids escalated. The Vikings were no longer just hit-and-run attackers. They were extortionists. Charlemagne had built a strong, centralized, and wealthy state. In doing so, he created the perfect target. His successors then weakened that state through internal conflict, leaving the doors to the treasury wide open. He had inadvertently drawn a map for the Vikings, marking all the best targets, and his grandsons had left the keys in the lock. Number 10, honor was worth more than a quiet life. Ulf was an old man now. It was the year 860 AD. He sat by the fire in his son's longhouse, his joints aching. He was surrounded by his grandchildren. He had lived a long life. He had a good farm, a respected family. By many standards, he was a success. But in the quiet moments, he felt a sense of shame. He had died a straw death. He had never gone a Viking. He had no great deeds for the skalds, the poets, to sing about. His name would be forgotten. In the Norse world, a man's reputation, his honor, was his most valuable possession. It was called Drekka. It was a combination of fame, glory, and respect. It was something you built throughout your life through your actions. A man with a great Drekka would be remembered long after he was gone. His story would be told in the sagas. This pursuit of honor was a powerful driver of behavior. A quiet, peaceful, and prosperous life was comfortable, but it did not earn a man a lasting reputation. Great honor was won through great deeds, and great deeds often involved great risk. Leading a successful raid, winning a difficult battle, or exploring unknown lands were all ways to build your Drekka. A chieftain who returned with ships full of plunder was not just wealthy, he was a man of proven ability. He was a man to be followed. His honor reflected on his entire family and his community. The Norse worldview also included a strong sense of fate, or word. They believed the course of a person's life, including the moment of their death, was preordained. While a person's actions mattered, the ultimate outcome was in the hands of the Norns, the weavers of fate. This belief did not lead to passivity. On the contrary, it encouraged a kind of courageous fatalism. If the time and manner of your death were already decided, there was no point in cowering in fear. The only thing you could control was how you faced your fate. It was better to die bravely in battle, earning honor and a place in Valhalla, than to die of old age and sickness. This attitude made them formidable warriors. They fought without fear because, in their minds, the outcome was already written. The only question was whether they would face it with courage. A man like Ulf, looking back on his life, might feel he had chosen the safe path over the honorable one. His son Ketil had heard the stories. He had seen the men who returned from the west with silver and scars. He saw the respect they commanded. He loved his father, but he did not want to be him. Ketil wanted his name to mean something. He wanted the skalds to compose verses about his courage. He wanted to leave a legacy for his own sons. The desire for wealth was a part of it, of course. Silver could buy security and influence, but the desire for honor, for a name that would outlive him, was a deeper, more powerful motivation. When a call went out for men to join a fleet sailing for the land of the Anglo-Saxons, Ketil was one of the first to volunteer. He was not driven by desperation or land hunger. His family was comfortable. He was driven by a cultural imperative. He was choosing the path of risk, the path of honor. He was choosing a chance at immortality through fame over the certainty of a long, quiet, and ultimately forgotten life. For many Vikings, honor was the ultimate currency, and raiding was the best way to earn it. Number 9, they were running a business, not just a war. Ivar the Boneless looked out over the English countryside in the year 866 AD. He was a leader of the great heathen army, a force unlike any that had come before. This was not a small-scale hit-and-run raid for plunder. This was an invasion. But it was an invasion run like a business. For Ivar and his fellow leaders, like his brother Halfdan, war was a commercial enterprise. The great heathen army was not a national army of a unified kingdom. It was a consortium of different war bands, a joint venture that had come together for a specific purpose, the systematic, long-term exploitation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Their strategy was not based on simple savagery. It was calculated. They did not just burn and pillage randomly. They had a clear business model. First, they identified and seized strategic assets. When they landed in East Anglia, their first move was to secure horses. This transformed their army from a slow-moving infantry force into a highly mobile one. They could now outmaneuver the local Anglo-Saxon armies, striking where they were least expected. They were faster and more flexible than the forces sent to stop them. Second, they targeted key economic and political centers. In 866, they captured the city of York, the capital of the Kingdom of Northumbria. They didn't just sack it and leave. They turned it into a fortified base of operations. From York, they could control the entire region. They minted their own coins. They controlled trade routes. They became the new management. Third, they understood the value of extortion. Their preferred tactic was to defeat an Anglo-Saxon army in the field, kill its king, and then install a puppet ruler. This new ruler would then be forced to pay the army a regular tribute, what the Anglo-Saxons called the Danegeld. This was a protection racket on a national scale. It was more profitable and sustainable than simple raiding. Why steal the golden eggs when you can take over the whole farm? The army itself was a well-organized logistical operation. It had to be fed, supplied, and paid. They established winter camps, large fortified settlements where they could repair their equipment, plan their next moves, and live through the cold months. Archaeologists have excavated camps like the one at Torksey in Lincolnshire. They found evidence of a bustling town with blacksmiths, merchants, and workshops. They found scales and weights for measuring silver and coins from all over the world. This was not a chaotic horde. It was a mobile, predatory corporation. Ivar and the other leaders were not just warriors, they were CEOs. They had to manage logistics, negotiate with enemies, distribute profits, plunder to their shareholders, the warriors, and plan for long-term growth. Their decisions were pragmatic and profit-driven. This business-like approach is what made the Great Heathen Army so effective and so terrifying. The Anglo-Saxons were used to fighting other kings for land and glory. They were not prepared for an enemy whose primary motivation was profit. The Vikings were not trying to conquer and settle in the traditional sense, at least not at first. They were asset stripping the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. For the individual warrior, this was a good arrangement. He was part of a large, successful enterprise. The risks were high, but the potential rewards were enormous. He received a regular share of the profits. He was a freelance contractor in a highly profitable, if violent, industry. Ivar's success was not just due to his ferocity in battle. It was due to his understanding that war could be a highly organized and very lucrative business. Number 8, the iron in their hills changed everything. Eric the Smith plunged the red-hot bar of iron into a barrel of water. The hiss of steam filled his small, smoky workshop. It was the year 790 AD. Outside, the world was one of wood, stone, and soil. But in here, Eric was working with the material that was quietly fueling a revolution: iron. Scandinavia did not have great veins of high-quality iron ore like other parts of Europe, but it had something else: bogs. All over the region, in the marshy wetlands, a form of iron ore called bog iron could be found. It formed naturally as iron-rich groundwater seeped into the bogs. Harvesting, it was simple. You could literally dig it out of the ground with a spade. This meant that access to iron was not controlled by a powerful king or a wealthy lord who owned a mine. It was decentralized, a local community, even a single farmer could gather their own ore. Eric's smithy was not grand, but it was effective. He used a simple bloomery furnace, a clay structure packed with charcoal and bog iron ore. Hours of intense heat, with air pumped in by a bellows, would produce a spongy mass of iron, a bloom. This bloom was then hammered repeatedly to remove impurities and consolidate the metal. This process was labor-intensive, but it could be done on a local scale. It meant that nearly every community of any size had its own smith, and every community had access to the raw materials to make iron tools and weapons. This widespread availability of iron had a profound impact. For farmers, it meant better plows, scythes, and axes. Better tools led to more efficient farming, which helped to support the growing population. But the real game changer was in the production of weapons. In other parts of Europe, equipping an army with iron swords and helmets was a major state expense. Weapons were precious. An army might consist of a few well-armed elites and a large number of poorly equipped levies. In Scandinavia, the situation was different. While a high-quality sword was still the mark of a wealthy warrior, a basic spearhead and an axe were affordable. A free farmer could be expected to own his own weapons. The axe, in particular, became the iconic Viking weapon. It was a dual-use tool. It could be used for felling trees on the farm during the week and for felling enemies on the weekend. This widespread weapon ownership created a different kind of society. It was a more militarized populace. A chieftain who wanted to launch a raid did not have to equip his followers from a central armory. He just had to persuade a group of already armed men to join him. The quality of their ironwork was also a factor. Norse smiths became masters of pattern welding, a technique where rods of different types of iron were twisted and forged together to create a blade that was both strong and flexible. A pattern-welded sword was a thing of beauty and a deadly weapon. It was also a massive status symbol. The iron rivets used in their longships were another crucial element. Tens of thousands of them were needed for a single ship. The ability to produce iron on this scale, locally and without central control, was essential to the shipbuilding boom that enabled the Viking Age. Eric, the smith, was not a warrior. He did not sail on the longships, but the iron tools and weapons he produced were the foundation of Viking power. The bog iron, seemingly worthless mud from a swamp, was a strategic resource. It armed the population, built the ships, and gave the Norse a technological edge that allowed a relatively small number of people to have an outsized impact on the world. Number 7, a marriage proposal could launch a fleet. Bjarni wanted to get married. It was the year 870 AD. He had his eye on Ingrid, the daughter of a neighboring landowner. Ingrid was beautiful and capable, and her father's farm was prosperous. A match between them would be good for both families. But there was a problem. Bjarni was a man of modest means. In Norse society, marriage was a contract between families. The groom or his family was expected to pay a bride price munder to the bride's father. This was not a case of buying a wife. It was a financial settlement that guaranteed the bride's security. It would be her property if her husband died or if they divorced. The bride's family, in turn, provided a dowry heimenfylgja, which was the property she brought with her into the marriage. But the initial hurdle was the bride price. A wealthy and respected man like Ingrid's father would expect a significant payment. He wanted to ensure his daughter was marrying a man of substance who could provide for her. Bjarni did not have the silver or the land to meet the expected price. His father could help a little, but not enough. Ingrid's father politely but firmly made it clear that Bjarni was not a suitable candidate. He needed to prove his worth. This was a common dilemma for young men. The social pressure to marry and start a family was immense, but the economic barrier could be high. This is where raiding came in. A few successful seasons of raiding could provide a young man with the capital he needed to secure a good marriage. The sagas are full of stories of young heroes who go abroad to make their fortune before they can marry their sweetheart. It was a socially acceptable, even expected path for a young man to take. For Bjarni, the rejection was a powerful motivator. He was not just seeking abstract wealth or honor. He had a specific goal in mind. He needed a certain amount of silver to impress Ingrid's father. He joined the crew of a longship captained by a famous Viking named Hastin. They were planning a long and ambitious voyage, not just to England or Francia, but further south to the Mediterranean. The risks were enormous, the potential profits were legendary. Bjarni was a farmer, not a natural-born warrior. But he learned quickly. He learned to row in time with the others, to handle a shield, to fight with an axe. He was driven by a clear vision, Ingrid's face. The voyage was brutal and long. They raided towns on the coast of Spain. They fought sea battles with Muslim patrols. They even sacked a city in Italy. Many men died. Bjarni was wounded twice. But he survived, and he collected his share of the plunder. After 2 years he returned home. He was no longer the boy who had left. He was a hardened man, his face weathered by the sun and sea, and he was wealthy. He walked to Ingrid's father's longhouse not as a hopeful suitor, but as a man of substance. He laid out a small chest of silver coins and a fine silk cloak from the east. The bride price was met. The marriage was arranged. Bjarni had used raiding as a tool to achieve a social and personal goal. This social pressure was a constant engine for the Viking Age. It ensured a steady supply of motivated young men for the raiding parties. They were not just fighting for greed or glory, and they were fighting for a family, for a future, for a place in society. A marriage proposal or the lack of one could be as powerful a cause for a raid as any king's command. Number 6. News traveled faster than you think. It was the winter of 841 AD. In a fjord in western Norway, a longship was pulled up on the shore for repairs. The crew was wintering at the farm of their chieftain, Olaf. The snow was deep, the wind was howling. But inside the longhouse, the air was warm and full of stories. A skald, a professional poet, was reciting a new poem. It was about a raid that had happened the previous summer. A chieftain named Asgeir had led a fleet to the mouth of the River Loire in Francia. He had established a base on an island called Noirmoutier. From there, he had plundered the surrounding countryside with great success. The skald's poem was not just entertainment. It was news. It was a report on current events. It described the route Asgeir had taken. It listed the towns he had sacked and the treasures he had won. It praised the courage of the men who had fought with him and mocked the weakness of the Franks. The men in Olaf's longhouse listened intently. This was valuable information. They learned that Noirmoutier was a good, defensible base for a raiding party. They learned that the Franks were disorganized and unable to drive Asgeir out. The story of Asgeir's success was an advertisement. It was a proof of concept. In a world without newspapers or mass communication, news traveled through stories, poems, and gossip. The Viking world was surprisingly well connected. Traders, raiders, and travelers moved constantly between Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the continent. They brought news with them. When a raiding party returned home, its members would disperse to their own farms for the winter. Each man would tell the story of the voyage to his family and neighbors. The most successful raids would become the stuff of legend, embellished and turned into poems by the skalds. This created a powerful copycat effect. A successful raid in one area would quickly inspire others to try the same thing. When the Vikings who attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 returned with their plunder, the news spread. It showed that the wealthy, undefended monasteries of England were easy targets. Soon, other groups were attacking other monasteries. The news of the Frankish civil wars spread in the same way. The stories of weakness and internal conflict encouraged larger and bolder raids. The news that Charles the Bald had paid the Vikings to leave Paris in 845 was the best news of all. It sent a clear message: Francia is rich and weak. The reward is high and the risk is manageable. This informal news network also allowed the Vikings to share tactical information. They learned from each other's successes and failures. They learned which rivers were navigable, which towns were fortified, and which local lords were likely to put up a fight. It was a form of open-source military intelligence. Olaf listened to the skald's poem about Noirmoutier. He was already planning his own expedition for the coming summer. He had been thinking of raiding the coast of Ireland, but the story of Asgeir's success was persuasive. The Loire Valley sounded more promising, more profitable. The poem was not just a story of the past, it was a plan for the future. The next spring, Olaf and his men would not sail west to Ireland. They would sail south to Francia. They would follow the path that Asgeir had blazed. The invisible network of stories and poems was one of the most powerful tools the Vikings had. It allowed them to coordinate their efforts, to concentrate their forces, and to exploit opportunities with remarkable speed. Number 5, they weren't just raiders, they were slavers. The market in Dublin was crowded and noisy. It was the year 875 AD. The city, founded by Vikings a few decades earlier, was a major hub of commerce. You could buy anything here: furs from the north, wine from Francia, silks from Byzantium, but one of the most valuable commodities being traded was people. A young Irish woman named Maeve stood on a wooden platform. She had been captured a week ago in a raid on her village. Her family had been killed. She had been tied up and marched to the coast, then thrown into the bottom of a longship. Now, she was being inspected by a Norse merchant. He checked her teeth. He looked at her hands to see if she was used to hard labor. For the Vikings, the slave trade was a central part of their economy. While we often think of them as plunderers of gold and silver, much of their wealth came from human trafficking. They called their slaves thralls. The raids on England, Ireland, and Francia were not just about smashing and grabbing portable wealth. They were also about capturing people. A healthy young man or woman was a valuable prize. They could be sold for a good price, or they could be taken back to Scandinavia to work on the farms. The agricultural economy back home depended on this labor. The men who were away raiding for the summer were not there to help with the haymaking or the harvest. Thralls filled this labor gap. They did the hardest and most unpleasant work, freeing up the Norse to pursue other activities like more raiding. A successful farm was often one with a large number of thralls, but the real money was in the international slave trade. The Vikings established a vast network. They would capture people in one place and sell them in another. And Irish slaves might be sold in the markets of Hedeby in Denmark. From there, they might be sold to traders who would take them to the booming slave markets of the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East. The river routes through what is now Russia were a major artery of this trade. The Rus, Vikings who had settled in the east, would raid Slavic villages, capturing people to sell in the south. The Arabic silver dirhams that have been found in such huge numbers in Scandinavia were often the payment for these slaves. This trade was brutal. People were treated as livestock, families were torn apart. The conditions on the ships were appalling. Many did not survive the journey. But for the Vikings, it was just business. A thrall was an asset, a piece of property. The existence of this slave economy changes our understanding of the Viking Age. It was not just about freelance warriors seeking glory. It was a system. Raiding provided the raw materials, people, for a vast and profitable commercial enterprise. The wealth that this trade generated financed more ships, better weapons, and larger expeditions. The merchant who bought Maeve was not a warrior. He was a businessman. He would likely sell her to another trader who would take her east. She would never see her home again. Her life would be one of servitude in a foreign land. The story of the Vikings is not complete without the story of their victims, as the gold and silver in their hoards were paid for with the lives and freedom of countless people like Maeve. The slave trade was the dark, a hidden engine that powered much of the Viking Age. Number 4, political chaos at home was a powerful push. Harold Finehair stood on a hill and looked down at the ships gathered in the fjord below. It was the year 872 AD, according to the later sagas. For years, Harold had been fighting a bloody campaign to achieve something unprecedented to become the sole king of all of Norway. Before him, Norway was not a single country. It was a mosaic of petty kingdoms and independent chieftaincies. Each local jarl or king ruled his own territory. They made alliances, they fought, but no single ruler had ever dominated the entire land. Harold was determined to change that. He was a ruthless and effective leader. He defeated his rivals one by one in a series of battles, culminating in the Great Sea Battle of Hafrsfjord. There, he crushed the last coalition of Western chieftains who stood against him. He had won. He was now the king of Norway, but his victory had a profound and unintended consequence. It created a new class of people, political exiles. The chieftains who had fought against Harold and lost were now faced with a stark choice. They could submit to his rule, pay him taxes, and accept a loss of their power and autonomy, or they could leave. For many of these proud and independent-minded men, submission was unthinkable. They had been their own masters, they would not bow to a new overlord, so they left, they gathered their families, their followers, and their possessions. They loaded them onto their longships and sailed away. They were not just raiders looking for plunder. They were refugees, settlers, and political dissidents. They were looking for a new place to live, a place where they could be free of King Harold's rule. This wave of migration was a major factor in the settlement of new lands. Many of these disgruntled chieftains and their followers sailed west across the sea. They were the first major wave of settlers in Iceland, a land they had heard about from earlier explorers. Iceland had no king. It offered them the chance to recreate the independent life they had lost. They established their own farms and their own system of government, the Althing, a general assembly of free men. Others went to the Orkney and Shetland Islands north of Scotland. Some went to the Faroe Islands. Others joined the Viking communities already established in Ireland and England. They brought with them their military skills and their resentment of centralized authority. This process was not unique to Norway. In Denmark and Sweden, similar processes of state formation were underway. Powerful kings were consolidating their power, crushing their rivals, and imposing taxes. Each step in this centralization created a new wave of exiles and malcontents who were pushed out of Scandinavia. So while factors like land hunger and the pursuit of wealth were pulling Vikings out into the world, political turmoil at home was a powerful push. The very process of creating the medieval kingdoms of Scandinavia fueled the Viking expansion. A chieftain named Ingolf, who had fought against Harold, made the decision to leave Norway for good. He would not live as a subject of the king who had defeated him. As he sailed away from the coast of his homeland, he was not just fleeing. He was carrying with him the seeds of a new society. The political chaos that had driven him out would lead to the creation of the Icelandic Republic, one of the most remarkable political entities of the Middle Ages. The push from home was just as important as the pull from abroad. Number 3. The first raids were probably accidents. Leif steered his ship carefully along the unfamiliar coastline. It was the year 789 AD. He and his crew were not warriors. They were traders from Hordaland in Norway. They were on a long voyage to the south, hoping to trade their walrus hide ropes and whetstones for Frankish wine. A storm had blown them off course. For 2 days, they had fought to keep their ship from being swamped by the massive waves. Now, the sea was calm, but they were lost, they were low on fresh water, and their food was running out. The land they saw before them was green and gentle, unlike the harsh coast of their home. This was the coast of Wessex, an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. They saw a small settlement near the mouth of a river. They needed to resupply. Leif decided to land. They beached their ship and approached the settlement cautiously. They were traders, not raiders. They had goods to barter. A man on horseback rode out to meet them. He was the local reeve, the king's official in the area. He was suspicious. He had never seen men like this before, or a ship of this design. He demanded to know who they were and what their business was. Well, he told them they must come with him to the king's town at Dorchester to be registered and to pay the appropriate trading tolls. Leif and his men did not understand the language well. They did not understand the concept of a royal toll. They were used to a more informal system of trade. They saw the reeve's demands as a threat. They thought he was trying to seize their ship and their goods. An argument broke out. Tempers flared. A fight started. The reeve and his men were killed. Leif and his crew were shocked and scared. They had not intended this, but it had happened. They knew they were in danger now. They quickly went through the settlement, taking what food and valuables they could find. They saw a small church and took a silver cross from its altar. Then they ran back to their ship, pushed it out into the water, and sailed away as fast as they could. This incident, recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, is often considered the first Viking raid on England. but it probably wasn't planned as a raid. It was likely a trade mission that went horribly wrong. It was an accident born of misunderstanding, fear, and cultural collision. When Leif and his men returned to Norway, they had a story to tell. They had a silver cross to show. They told of a land that was rich and fertile, and they told of a people who were not well prepared for a fight. The local official had only a few men with him. The village was undefended, the story spread. Other traders and explorers might have had similar experiences. A landing for water turns into an opportunity to steal some unguarded sheep. A trade negotiation breaks down and ends in violence. These early small-scale encounters were a learning process. The Norse discovered, perhaps by accident, that the lands to the west and south were full of soft targets. They found wealthy monasteries where the only inhabitants were unarmed monks. They found farming communities with no defenses. The line between trading and raiding was thin. A ship could set out with the intention of doing either. If they encountered a well-defended town where trade was possible, they would trade. If they found an undefended village or monastery, they might choose to raid. They were opportunists. The great raids of the later Viking Age were well-planned military operations, but they were built on the knowledge gained from these earlier accidental encounters. The first Vikings may not have even thought of themselves as raiders. They were traders and explorers who stumbled into a new and very profitable business model. The transformation was gradual, an evolution from accidental conflict to intentional, organized plunder. Number 2, their victims weren't prepared for hit and run. Brother Alcuin stared at the smoking ruins of the church. It was June of 793 AD. Just a few days ago, the monastery of St. Cuthbert on the island of Lindisfarne had been a place of peace, prayer, and learning. It was one of the holiest sites in Anglo-Saxon England. Now, it was a scene of devastation. The attack had come from the sea without warning. 3 longships had appeared on the horizon. They moved with terrifying speed. Before the monks could even comprehend what was happening, the ships were on the beach. Wild-looking men with axes and shields leaped out and ran towards the monastery. The monks were scholars, not soldiers. They had no weapons, they had no defenses. The island was a holy place, a sanctuary. They had believed that God was their shield. The raiders were brutal and efficient. They killed some of the monks. They took the golden cross from the altar, the silver chalices, and the jeweled covers of the holy books. They rounded up the younger monks and novices, tied their hands, and dragged them back to the ships. Then, as quickly as they had come, they were gone. The entire raid had lasted only a few hours. By the time word reached the king of Northumbria and he could begin to gather his army, the raiders were long gone, back out to sea. This was the fundamental problem for the victims of the early Viking raids. Their entire system of defense was unprepared for this new kind of warfare. Anglo-Saxon and Frankish warfare was based on land. Armies were composed of the king's followers and a general levy of farmers, the fyrd. These armies were slow to assemble. A message had to be sent, men had to gather their equipment, and then they had to march to the point of attack. This process could take weeks. Their defensive strategy was also land-based. They built fortified towns and castles, burhs, to control territory. They fought set-piece battles where 2 armies would meet in an open field. The Vikings refused to play by these rules. Their key advantage was mobility. The longship was a strategic weapon. It allowed them to bypass all the land-based defenses. They could appear anywhere on a coastline hundreds of miles long. They could sail up rivers and strike deep inland at targets that thought they were safe. They chose their targets carefully. They went for wealth that was concentrated in poorly defended monasteries and trading towns. They had no interest in fighting a pitched battle against a professional army. That was a high-risk, low-reward proposition. Their strategy was hit and run. They would strike, gather as much loot and as many slaves as they could carry, and then disappear back to the sea before the local defense force could arrive. It was a classic case of asymmetric warfare. The Vikings used their speed and unpredictability to terrorize their victims and avoid their strengths. For a local lord, it was an impossible situation. He could not be everywhere at once. He could keep his army together in one place, but then the Vikings would just attack somewhere else. He could disperse his forces to guard the entire coast, but then his small detachments would be too weak to fight off a determined raiding party. Alcuin, a great English scholar who was serving in Charlemagne's court, was horrified when he heard the news from Lindisfarne. He wrote letters expressing his shock that such a holy place could be violated. He saw it as a punishment from God. But it was not a supernatural event. It was a failure of military doctrine. The Anglo-Saxons and the Franks were like a strong, slow-moving bear. The Vikings were like a swarm of wasps. The bear could kill any single wasp it could catch, but it could not defend itself from being stung 100 times from 100 different directions. It would take them decades to adapt and develop new strategies, like building a navy and a system of coastal forts to counter this new, terrifying form of hit-and-run warfare. Number one, fame was the ultimate currency. Ragnar was more than a man, he was a story. Whether he was a single historical person or a composite of several, by the year 900 AD, his name was known all across the Viking world. He was the hero of poems and sagas. He was the raider who had sacked Paris. He was the warrior who had been cast into a pit of snakes by an English king, defiantly proclaiming how the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. His sons, men like Ivar the Boneless and Bjorn Ironside, were not just powerful chieftains. They were the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. And his fame was their inheritance. It was a form of capital, more valuable than silver. In the Viking Age, fame was the ultimate currency. A man's reputation, what the skalds sang about him, was the foundation of his power. A leader with a great name could attract the best warriors to his banner. Young men would flock to join the crew of a famous raider, knowing that he was a proven winner. Serving with him was a chance to gain wealth, but also to gain a share of his glory. Fame had a snowball effect. A successful raid brought plunder. The leader would use this plunder to give generous gifts to his followers, which increased his fame as a great lord. This increased fame would attract more followers, allowing him to undertake even more ambitious expeditions. These expeditions, if successful, would generate more plunder and more fame. This pursuit of a lasting name was a primary motivation. The Norse did not write history books. Their history was preserved in the epic poems and sagas recited from memory in the longhouses. To be the subject of a saga was to achieve a kind of immortality. A man's body might die, but his name and his deeds would live forever on the lips of the skalds. This is why leaders often took on dramatic brand names: Eric Bloodaxe, Harold Bluetooth, Ivar the Boneless. These were memorable, marketable names that added to a leader's mystique. The desire for fame drove them to undertake incredible feats of daring. They were not just seeking material gain, they were building their personal legend. The first Viking to sail up an unknown river, the first to defeat a famous champion, the first to see a new land. These were the deeds that made a man a hero. The invasion of England by the Great Heathen Army in 865 was said to have been led by the sons of Ragnar, seeking to avenge their father's death. Whether this is historically accurate or not, it shows how important the idea of legacy was. The sons were not just carving out kingdoms for themselves. They were acting out the next chapter of their father's saga. They were living up to his famous name. This focus on individual fame also explains the competitive and fragmented nature of Viking activity. It was not a coordinated national effort. It was a world of entrepreneurs, each trying to make a name for himself. They competed with each other for followers and for glory. Sometimes they cooperated, as in the Great Heathen Army. Other times they fought each other. A young man setting out on his first raid was not just thinking about the silver he might win, and he was thinking about the story he would be able to tell when he got home. He was taking the first step on the path to building his own reputation. He dreamed that one day the skalds might compose a verse about him. The physical treasures the Vikings looted are now in museums. But the fame they sought has, in a way, been achieved. We still tell their stories. We still know the names of Ragnar, Ivar, and Eric. In the end, this was the currency that mattered most. The desire for a name that would never be forgotten was the single most powerful force that turned peaceful farmers into the legendary raiders of the North.